The military history of New Zealand is an aspect of the history of New Zealand that spans several hundred years. When first settled by Maori almost a millennium ago, there was much land and resources. But war began to break out as the country's carrying capacity was approached. Initially being fought with close-range weapons of wood and stone, this continued on and off until Europeans arrived, bringing with them new weapons such as muskets. Colonization by Britain led to the New Zealand Land Wars in the 19th century, in which settler and imperial troops and the Maori allies fought against other Maori and a handful of Pakeha. In the first half of the 20th century, New Zealanders of all races fought alongside Britain in the Boer War and both World Wars. In the second half of the century and into this century, the New Zealand Defence Force has provided token assistance to the United States in several conflicts. New Zealand has also contributed troops extensively to multilateral peacekeeping operations. Maori tribal warfare before 1806. The level of intertribal warfare amongst pre-European Maori is unknown. Oral histories, legends and whakapapa include many stories of battles and wars, but little research has been carried out into how often wars actually happened. In Making Peoples, James Belich argues that they were probably uncommon in the few centuries immediately after the arrival of Maori in New Zealand in about 1280 CE, as there was ample land and resources to go around. Archaeological evidence suggests that following population growth and the extinction of the Moa, warfare increased as tribes and hapu competed over scarce resources. At some point, perhaps before this cultural change, one group migrated to the Chatham Islands, where they developed the largely pacifist Moriori culture. Their pacifism left the Moriori unable to defend themselves when the islands were invaded by mainland Maori in the 1830s. In the classic Maori culture of 1550 CE onward, warriors were held in high esteem, and fought with a range of weapons including stone and wooden clubs, fighting staffs and spears. Maori were unusual in having no distance weapons such as bows or slings, so all fighting took place at close range. Defense was based on hill forts, the remains of which can be seen all over New Zealand, especially the North Island. The largest battle recorded was that of Hingakaka with several thousand combatants. Musket Wars 1806 to 1845. The Musket Wars were a series of battles in the early 19th century, fought between various Maori tribal groups, mainly on the North Island. Northern tribes, such as the rival Ngapuhi and Ngāti Whātua, were the first to obtain muskets and inflicted heavy casualties upon each other and on neighboring tribes, some of whom had never seen firearms. In time, all the tribes traded to obtain muskets and the conflict ultimately reached an uneasy stalemate. The wars gave Maori experience in fighting with and defending against guns, experience which would be vital in the New Zealand Wars. In the Harriet Affair of 1834, a group of British soldiers of the 50th Regiment from Australia landed in Taranaki to rescue the wife and children of John Guard and punish the kidnappers. The first clash between Maori and British troops. The expedition was sent by Governor Burke from Sydney, but was subsequently criticised for use of excessive force by a British House of Commons report in 1835. New Zealand Wars. The New Zealand or Land Wars were a series of wars fought between Maori on one side and a mixture of settler troops, imperial troops and other Maori on the other. What the wars were about has been debated by historians, with Keith Sinclair arguing that they were about land, while James Belich has argued that although land was a major factor, the wars were essentially a contest over sovereignty. This debate is reflected in the naming of the wars. There is no real consensus over whether they should be called the New Zealand Wars or the Land Wars. Although Belich's television series about the conflict has popularized the former term, the name Maori Wars has fallen into disuse. A Maori name for the conflict is Te Riri Pakeha. While the fighting began in 1843 and the last shots were arguably fired in the early 20th century, the bulk of fighting took place in the 1860s. The first skirmish of the New Zealand Wars was the 1843 Waikato Affair at the north end of the South Island. It was an isolated incident caused by the Nelson settlers trying to seize land they did not own, an extra-legal vigilante action that resulted in 22 of them being killed. The Flagstaff or Northern War took place in the far north of New Zealand, around the Bay of Islands, in March 1845 and January 1846. This was about mana, tribal prestige, and customs duties. It was really a war between rival Maori chiefs, with the British fighting on one side for the prestige of the British Empire. This was followed almost immediately by the Hutt Valley Campaign, March to August 1846, and the Wanganui Campaign, April to July 1847, in the southwest of the North Island. Both these conflicts were about the encroachment of the European settlers onto Maori land. In the first three wars, Maori fought the British to a standstill each time. From the engagements emerged an understanding. English law prevailed in the townships and settlements, and Maori law and customs elsewhere. There followed a period of relative peace and economic cooperation from 1848 to 1860. During this time, European settlement accelerated, and in about 1859 the number of Pakeha came to equal the number of Maori, at around 60,000 each. By now Pakeha had largely forgotten the painful lessons of the earlier conflicts. They tried to use military might to push through a very dubious land sale that the courts later repudiated. The result was the First Taranaki War. Once again the local British forces were more than evenly matched by Maori, and after 12 months both sides were happy to settle for a draw. However, this was clearly just a preliminary. The British settlers were not prepared to countenance Maori controlling and ruling most of the land in the North Island. War broke out again in 1863 with the invasion of the Waikato. To assist in this war, a temporary navy was established. This was the Waikato Flotill, New Zealand's first de facto navy, comprising 8 river boats, 4 armoured barges, 5 coastal boats and a naval dockyard. The Waikato War, including the Tauranga Campaign, was the biggest of all the New Zealand wars. The outcome of this war was the major confiscation of land owned by Maori, which quickly provoked the Second Taranaki War. By the mid-1860s the conflict had forced the closing of all the native schools. The period from the second half of 1864 until early 1868 was relatively quiet. Possibly the most notorious incident during this time was the murder of the missionary Karl Volkner. There were also 2 serious intra-tribal conflicts, civil wars in Maori tribes, between adherents and non-adherents of the Pari Maori or Hauhau sect, a vehemently anti-Pakeha religious group which was intent upon balancing the developing unbalanced cooperation between the Maori and Pakeha. These are sometimes known as the East Cape War, but that label oversimplifies a complicated series of conflicts. The last major conflicts were Te Kuti's War and Tito Kawaru's War. These were fought at the same time but were not related to each other and should be considered as separate conflicts. This ended the major, violent conflicts between the new colonial government and the original occupants of the land. There were subsequently other conflicts and incidents that were a part of the overall conflict, but are not usually seen in the context of the New Zealand Wars. The invasion of Parihaka in 1881 was certainly one of these. There was an incident in the 1890s that became known as the Dog Tax War. Another was the arrest of Ruakenana in 1916. It is even possible that events at Bastion Point in the 1970s should be considered as part of the same scenario. Second Boa War 1899 to 1902. The Second Boa War, fought from the 11th of October 1899 until the 31st of May 1902, and between the British Empire and the two independent Boer republics of the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, resulted from the history of British encroachment into or involvement in areas already settled by Afrikaners, who were known colloquially as Boers, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers. This was exacerbated by the discovery of gold and diamonds in the South African Republic, after which many miners from British Empire countries migrated there. New Zealand decided to help fight for the Empire and sent 6,500 mounted troops to assist the British efforts, making the war New Zealand's first overseas military campaign. Virtually every man in New Zealand was desperately keen to get to war, so the first soldiers to go were selected on the basis of who could afford to go. If a man could provide his own horse, rifle and equipment, costing about £25 in total, he could go to war. The first 2 of the 10 contingents paid their own way. The proposal to send the first contingent, 200 mounted riflemen, was approved by Parliament prior to the outbreak of war on 28 September 1899. Prime Minister Richard Seddon's proposition to do so was overwhelmingly supported, meeting opposition from only 5 members of Parliament. The women of New Zealand were also supportive of the war. Girls' and ladies' khaki corps were organised throughout the country during 1900 to raise funds as part of New Zealand's South African war effort. Denied entry into active war service, women threw themselves into patriotic work on the home front. The contingents were quickly established throughout New Zealand in cities and small towns. Young society women dressed in khaki uniforms with skirts and hats. The Khaki Corps had a full range of military titles, and local volunteer officers coached members in military exercises. Members participated in influential fundraising events such as the Patriotic Carnival at Government House in 1900, organised by Lady Douglas in aid of the Wellington More Men Fund. In total, New Zealand provided 10 contingents to the British, numbering 6,500 men. New Zealand losses were 71 men killed in action, 25 killed in accidents and 133 of disease. Figures for New Zealanders serving with units outside of the New Zealand contingents are unknown. First World War 1914 to 1918. When the United Kingdom declared war on Germany at the start of the First World War, the New Zealand government followed without hesitation. Despite its geographic isolation and small population, the total number of New Zealand troops and nurses to serve overseas in 1914 to 1918, excluding those in British and other Dominion forces, was 103,000. From a population of just over 1 million, 42% of men of military age served in the NZEF. 16,697 New Zealanders were killed and 41,317 were wounded during the war, a 58% casualty rate. Approximately a further 1,000 men died within 5 years of the war's end, as a result of injuries sustained, and 507 died whilst training in New Zealand between 1914 and 1918. The First World War saw Maori soldiers officially serve for the first time in a major conflict with the New Zealand Army. 2,688 Maori and 346 Pacific Islanders served with New Zealand forces in total. New Zealand's first act of the war was to seize and occupy German Samoa. Although Germany refused to officially surrender the islands, no resistance was offered and the occupation took place without any fighting, the first German territory to be occupied in the name of King George V. After Major General Alexander Godley departed with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in October 1914, Major General Alfred William Robin commanded New Zealand military forces at home throughout the war as commandant, and was pivotal in ensuring the ongoing provision of reinforcements and support to the New Zealand military forces within New Zealand. The first major battle fought by New Zealand troops was Gallipoli, A navigational error led to the Anzacs being landed at the wrong place. 2,701 New Zealanders were killed and 4,852 wounded during a bitter struggle which failed to achieve any military objectives. Despite this, the significance of the Battle of Gallipoli was strongly felt in New Zealand, where it was the first great conflict experienced by the fledgling nation. The landing is commemorated in New Zealand and Australia each year, on Anzac Day. New Zealanders fought elsewhere in the Middle East, where they took part in the ultimately successful Sinai and Palestine campaign against the Turkish. New Zealanders fought in most of the battles leading up to the fall of Jerusalem and the defeat of the Ottoman army, and were praised for their fighting alongside their Australian and British comrades. A total of 17,723 New Zealanders served in this campaign, and New Zealand casualties were 640 killed in action and 1,146 wounded. In France, the New Zealand division participated in the Battle of the Somme, where they advanced 3 kilometers and captured 8 kilometers of enemy front line. 7,048 had become casualties, of whom 1,560 were killed. In June 1917, the New Zealand division further distinguished itself in the storming of Messines Ridge and the capture of the village of Messines. During the fighting at Passchendaele in the following October, however, it was bloodily repulsed in its second attack, with 850 dead in exchange for no more than 500 yards of ground gained. This was the first time the division had failed in a major operation, but more notably remains the worst disaster in New Zealand's history in terms of lives lost in a single day. The division also fought against the German Spring Offensive of 1918. Later they captured the town of Le Quesnoy in a daring assault led by Lieutenant Leslie Cecil Lloyd Averill on 4 November 1918. The date proved to be division's most successful of their whole time on the Western Front as they pushed east and advanced 10 kilometers, capturing 2,000 German soldiers and 60 field guns. New Zealand also contributed to the war at sea. The cruiser HMS Philomel patrolled the Gulf of Alexandretta in the eastern Mediterranean, supporting several landings and sustaining 3 fatal casualties, one being the first New Zealander killed in action in the war. She also took part in the defense of the Suez Canal, operations in the Gulf of Aden and patrols in the Persian Gulf. In June 1917, a German raider laid minefields in New Zealand waters, causing the loss of a merchant ship off Farewell Spit and another off Three Kings Islands. New Zealand had no air force of her own during the First World War, but several hundred New Zealanders served with the Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Naval Air Service, the Royal Air Force and Australian Flying Corps. The main base for New Zealanders while in Europe was Sling Camp on the Salisbury Plains in England. The camp is now gone, but the 420-foot-high chalked Bulford Kiwi that the troops carved into hillside while awaiting repatriation remains to this day.